Great. So first of all, thank the author for the presentation. First of all, obviously, the usual disclaimer applies, right? My comments and views presented here are my own and not of the central bank. So just to basically what I'm going to try to do in these very short minutes is try to show what my main understanding, my main takeaways from the papers are, and some additional comments I think are worth discussing. All right, so the way I see it is the paper, what it does, it grabs an interesting topic, which is we have this empirical relationship between energy and food prices. And we see that through the different series of moments, say correlation, for example, this empirical relation has changed, especially in the past decades, right? So it has increased. And what the authors try to do is basically try to identify what causes what from a supply side point of view. They formalize it, they call this spillovers, and they do this through an empirical approach. And the way they do this has, I believe, an interesting feature which allows to see the changes in these spillovers throughout time versus what would be a sample split. Okay, right. So the methodology is empirical. Essentially, what I see they do is the author already explained is they run a TVP time varying Bayesian bar where they have the set of autoregressive variables, which basically show you go from supply shocks in either oil or food.
Sorry,
yes.
Sorry. Can you use the full screen, please?
Yes, I'm trying to use it, but for some reason, every time I do it,
okay.
Yeah, it's trying to kick me out of the event, and I don't want to do that. So I don't want to risk it. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Great. Right. So yeah. So what the authors do is they run this autoregressive vector, right, where you have start with supply for oil, supply for food, and then you go to see what the impact is on price of oil and across commodity, whether that be food or metals or other types of agricultural raw material, right? And on top of that Bayesian bar, right, what they add is to determine the path of the parameter that state equations, that essentially what they say is, well, this parameter, these particular set of parameters are going to move throughout time, right? And they're going to move throughout time through a series of innovations that are going to have size nu, z, and a, right? And this is, I think, something very important we should keep in mind, because depending on how you set the variance of these parameters is basically how hard you're going to be on the estimator and how much you're going to allow it to move throughout time and how much you're going to allow it to jump or not, right? So that's one thing I think we should keep in mind. I'll make a final comment on that later. So we have a Bayesian bar, we have a Bayesian bar, we have a state equation to determine the law of motion for the parameters that change throughout time. And then, of course, the ultimate question is, well, where does the exogeneity, so to identify the spillovers, come from, right? So what the authors propose are, in the case of oil shocks, they follow the criteria of Baumeister and Pearsman, that essentially what it says is, if you see that in the very immediate run, you could say, you see that supply goes in one way and price goes the other way, then you will assume that that is a supply shock, and that you use that as your identification strategy. In the case of food supply, the approach, the justification for using changes in supply in the current quarter is different, right? So the authors, what they do is they use this interesting feature that agriculture has, which is that when you want to decide how much you want to produce in your farm, well, you have to make that decision a quarter before the quarter you're going to harvest, right? So what that basically implies is that the quarter prices during the current quarter are not going to induce changes into supply, and therefore you can consider any changes in supply as an exogenous source. So the authors may show many findings. I think my main takeaways from this paper are first of all is that, well, prior to 2000, oil shocks didn't affect food prices, at least not significantly, and that this has changed in recent decades, right? So the authors already shown this in the different graphs. And they show that the same occurs the other way around, right? You go from food to oil and you find a similar finding. I think this is obviously the most important finding they have. A second feature is that authors show some results that induce that oil and food supply shocks can also go to other commodities that are not just oil and food, right? So they show minerals, they also show agricultural raw materials. The authors suggest this is evidence against the biofuel hypothesis, right? So the idea that the correlation between oil and food is not because the biofuel, because hey, when we look at other commodities that have nothing to do with the biofuel industry, we still see that spillover anyway. And then there's a third interesting feature, which I think it's important for at least those of us who work in policy, which is the effects on inflation, right? So the idea is like, given that you have these spillovers, well, if oil prices increase, that's not going to affect just the oil price or the energy part of your CPI index. It's also going to affect the food index and why not other parts of the index as well. Now, some comments on this is why up to here is what my main understanding of the paper, my main takeaway, what I consider to be, I think, the most interesting results. I would like to have to add some comments. Well, first, I agree that the topic is relevant. Financialization of commodities, and especially this correlation between food and energy, is of interest of both the literature and also to policymakers. There have actually been attempts to regulate these things due to these changes in these moments. And I think the one feature I really like personally is this time varying feature that allows you to, instead of just doing a sample split and seeing if this parameter is statistically different than the other one, then the time varying approach allows you to have a better understanding of the dynamics of the parameter. And I'll show in a second why I think this particular feature is interesting. And then, of course, there's also the trying to find some degree of causality between these two industries is also, I think, a very interesting piece of evidence. Now, so as I mentioned, I said one of the features I like the most is time varying. And the reason is because of the following. Some bureaus have made comments in this sense, right? So when we look at the results, right here we have the summary of the figures in the paper. Many of these figures have already been shown by the authors in the presentation. If we look at the second column here, which shows the normalized spillovers from food to oil and oil to food, we see something that has already been mentioned, which is there seems to be a big driver, which is the 2009 crisis, right? So, or at least something's going on in 2009. Obviously, the first thing that will come up to everyone's head is, well, there was a huge crisis there. The crisis was obviously common across all commodities, all industries, worldwide, all countries. So one big question that comes up is, well, how much of these results are just driven by this 2009 event? Now, I think this doesn't necessarily mean anything against the paper, because given that the paper is time varying, we have the ability to spot this. So in this sense, I believe this is a strength. But it does bring up a red flag to if you want to extend the results to the current day, right? So think if we're as policymakers, for example, thinking of, okay, how will these spillovers affect my projections for 2020, 2021? Well, what the results in the paper suggest is, wait a second, there's a big chance that given this time varying structure that we've used, there's a big chance that most of the results are just driven by the 2009 event, where there's a shock that was obviously common to all industries. So that's one of the biggest things that came up in my mind. And again, some comments, some viewers already have made this comment. Then some additional comments is, first of all, the identification strategy for food supply, right? So remember, the authors, what the main point of the authors is, well, when you produce food, you have to plan it in the previous quarter. Hence, any changes in prices in this quarter will not affect the changes in quantity or the changes of supply during the harvest quarter, and therefore you can consider any changes in the harvest as exogenous. Well, that is, I believe, to be true, but not to the full, not 100% true, right? So when you look at the farm industry, basically when you produce food, you have obviously the decision of planting, and is a very big aspect of how much food you're going to produce. But a second important aspect is, when the harvest comes, you always have the option to not harvest it. Harvesting it is costly. It implies hiring people. It implies use of machinery, use of energy, actually. And it also implies commercializing, which is also cost. Now, for the vast majority of farmers, this is as much of a deal. They'll pick up the harvest anyway. But for the marginal farmer, this could be an issue. And it does happen that now and then farmers decide to basically not lift up their profit if they don't see that the price justifies paying the harvest cost, right? And usually what farmers would do is they would just leave it for earth soiling for the next harvest, for the next planting season to show up. So in practical terms, what I think this feature would imply is if we have big shocks of supply on food production, then I wouldn't worry about this potential endogeneity issue. But if the changes apply as marginal, let's say 2%, 1%, 3%, then there could be some endogeneity within that changes apply. Right. So just to give an idea, if you look at USDA data for corn production in the U.S., you'll find that for every 100 acres that are planted, approximately 93, 94 are harvested. So there's always a 5 to 7% of acres that are not actually picked up in corn production, at least. And that's just to give some heads up that there is some of this idea that the marginal farmer will not always decide to pick up his or her production if they see that prices aren't very good. Right, and then, second comment, second minor comment is, the authors, obviously the evidence they present, they suggest that it favors hypothesis against the biofuel hypothesis. The way I see it is, results, what they find is, I think is evidence for alternative hypothesis, but it doesn't mean it goes against the biofuel hypothesis. I mean, when you look at the alternative hypothesis and the spillovers that go to minerals and agricultural materials, whatever, even if we completely take those rules, that doesn't mean that the biofuel hypothesis does not take place. The results that the authors show, it does not necessarily go against them. So I think we just should have that in mind when we look at when we discuss the biofuel theory for the correlation. And then a final comment, which goes back to what I mentioned before, which is I think it would be interesting to see robustness to priors, but not to all priors, which would be like something very easy to say. But particularly, I think one interesting prior, one important prior is how sensible are the results to the variance that you input as a prior in your state equations, right? Because depending on the size of the variance you input in those state equations here, on the size of the volatility of the variance on the mu, on z, and eta, is basically the instruction you give the model, how much should you punish movements throughout time, right? So for example, if you put a very small volatility, you're telling the model, punish very hard, big changes in your parameter, and therefore you're going to have smooth transitions. The model is going to deliver smooth transitions because it doesn't want to show you big jumps because you've told the model to not do so. Now, that's just a prior. Obviously, as you start estimating, priors die off and eventually they'll disappear. It will be interesting to see up to what extent does the prior that you input in the model change the observing results. And that's pretty much my main takeaways and comments. I'd like to thank again the authors for the presentation and the paper.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. We have a question from the audience first. Fabricio Venditti has a question. Francisco, can you open his microphone? And anyone that want to ask a question, please let us know in the Q&A section.
Okay, Fabricio, have the microphone on.
Hi, yes. My question is, if you try to double check that you actually are identifying adverse supply shocks, whether you added a measure of current economic conditions to these models to see if these shocks are really recessionary. I see that you have some results for the composite leading composite index of OECD, but these are different variables. So have you tried this? Because with set identified VRs, it is the case that sometimes you find rotations in which you see a negative correlation between the production of oil and oil prices, but then you also need to check some other conditional correlations, right?
Okay, thank you. So there is no other questions so far. So Wouter, you can you can react to the discussion and answer the question.
All right. All right. Thank you very much for the elaborate discussion, Francisco. Let's start with your point on how 2009 appears to be a very important driver of our results. That is true, but one should not forget that the spillovers already emerged way before 2009. And in addition, the fact that the spillovers peak in 2008 actually may be very much in line with the informational friction story, because precisely during the global financial crisis, market participants were very curious to learn about how the financial crisis was going to affect economic activity. So they might have been very much looking at commodity prices. And hence, if these market participants would have seen a commodity price shift, especially during the global financial crisis around 2008, they would have responded to these price shifts by adjusting their commodity demand, because just uncertainty is so large. So the signal that they could get from commodity prices was very salient or very, very important to use, because uncertainty was very large. In addition, a third comment on that suggestion that the 2009 event might have been driving some of the results is that, as you mentioned appropriately, the 2009 crisis was common to all markets, to all countries, was a global event, while the results that I'm showing, they are conditional on supply shifts. So they are purified from common drivers in both markets. And therefore, we believe that we shouldn't worry that our results really are showing spillovers across markets that increase and decrease over time. And they may peak around 2008, because precisely then uncertainty was large, which means that precisely then people were craving for information. And if commodity markets aggregate information, you can look at commodity markets and infer from that signal of global economic activity. Next, you mentioned, very interestingly, actually, the Johnson et al. Paper in 2017, and you mentioned that 5% of all harvests of all crops are not harvested. I wasn't aware of that statistic, but I'm wondering whether it's a US statistic or a global statistic, whether it is 5% of US harvests or 5% across the globe, because we also have been thinking a lot about it. And actually, the paper that introduces this food production index did a substantial robustness analysis to ensure that the residual from this food production equation does not contain the endogenous responses you were referring to. But I took the note of the Johnson paper, and we will for sure have a look at it. It surprised me to some extent still that if 5% of crops are not harvested, but left for soil as a fertilizer for the soil for the next planting season, because at the same time it can be very dangerous to leave your crops on the land, because they may start rotting and spoil your soil for many years to come. So
what you do is you flip it around.
Sorry?
Yeah, just to give you a quick answer.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So the data, Okay. Yeah. So the data I found is I threw in a table is for corn production of the U.S. only. Just as
Okay.
a heads up, not to like focus on that, just to give like an idea. It's because I worked with that data in the past and I remember it. Just to give you an idea. And I do know that what some farmers decide to do is they would, depending on the crop, they would just flip it around, flip the soil around and let it go and use it as fertilizer. That's just one option. So most of the time they'll just throw it away or some other way. Again, it's just a marginal decision. Vast majority of farmers will just harvest anyway. But on the margin, there might be for the small shocks, like there might be some of it. But yeah. But just to answer your question, the data I mentioned was for corn production for the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the note. I also want to add to this when they just I don't know, they flip the soil around and wait for the next planting season. That would, as you mentioned correctly, that would entail an endogenous response that we don't have in our food production index. But on the other hand, what is more common is that crops would still be harvested but then destroyed afterwards or not brought to the market afterwards, and that would still be in our production index. So we'll have a look at the data that you mentioned, but for now, I would like to hold to believe that our food production index is still very qualitative. And you also made the point that we cannot exclude the biofuels transmission channel, and it's very, very true. So there is no way that we can refute biofuels as a transmission for these spillovers. What we can say is that something else is going on for sure as well. Something else is going on for sure as well because of precisely these results that I showed you, that the food shock spills over to metal prices and raw materials, and that the oil shock also spills over to these other commodity prices that have nothing to do with the substitution possibilities enabled by the biofuel sector. So no, we cannot exclude the biofuel story, but we can show other evidence that can show this other evidence that indicates that something else is going on, and new results that we are going to incorporate very soon in the paper. We are actually really trying to link the size of the spillover to a time series of uncertainty and a time series of financialization of commodity markets. And what we then see is that actually the spillover emerges as uncertainty increases or financialization increases, and mostly when the interaction of the two increases. And these results will be incorporated very soon in a new version of the paper. With respect to the priors, exactly. So if you want, you can shut down all the time variation by just having very, very small variances for these innovations in the state equation. But there we have a very nice sanity check to be sure that we are not showing crazy results from crazy priors. And this sanity check is the linear VR. This linear VR is an approximation of the average parameter values, or approximates the average parameter values over two subsamples. And what we see is that the results are fairly comparable. So that should be reassuring. Fabrizio Venditti, you mentioned to double check, the supply shock. I can reassure you that, so we have estimated VERs with global economic activity and also global price indices, and the results really stay very much the same. And it is very, very reassuring that our supply shock from the imposed responses on oil production and oil prices, our supply shocks looks very, very similar to the results in Baumeister and Peersman. And I think they also put a restriction on global economic activity. And essentially, it's not strictly necessary, because only the oil supply shock will move prices and quantities in opposing directions. I think I have addressed the main concerns raised in the question, so they were all very interesting and valuable. Thank you very much. If there are other questions,
We have time for a couple of questions.
yes.
We have 7 minutes left. So Juan Pablo Medina wants to ask something. Francisco, can you open the microphone for Juan Pablo?
Okay, give me a second. Okay, Juan Pablo, have the microphone on.
Okay, can you hear me well? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe I have to read the paper. I was having a question regarding that you mentioned regarding the informational friction, that is the idea that the market have the wrong perception that is a demand shock, but in fact it's a supply shocks. So, but in fact, but then you have the identification that in your empirical model you have the supply shocks. So how you reconcile, you connect these two things, that you are saying that you have the identification of supply shocks, but then in the end, the market have the wrong perception, because that is your emphasis, that is a demand shock. So, and also that connect with the comment of Francisco saying that in 2009, you have a wrong, you have a important part that comes from your results. So when 2009 is a moment of a huge global demand fall, so how you connect in the end this idea that you have this idea that you favor the wrong perception of demand shocks that is confused with these supplies, but in the end you have identification of supply shocks. So how you make and taking together that the 2009 is a very important moment of movement in global demand.
So for the food supply shock, we don't have to worry, because it is identified as a reduced form residual from variation in production and food production. For the oil supply shock, you may argue that if this additional demand, so suppose there is an adverse oil supply shock that increases oil prices, and market participants interpret this as an upturn in a global business cycle and increase their commodity demand across the board, also they would also increase the commodity demand for oil, then this adverse oil supply shock came with an additional shift of the demand curve for oil. And in some situations, if this is going on very strongly, you are correct in raising the point that are identifying assumptions of opposing responses of oil production and oil prices after an oil supply shock. It's a very valid concern, but still, so if this were the case, the shock would be identified as a demand shock. And we're not showing the results, or we're not showing spillovers after the demand shock, or so we're identifying a supply shock that moves prices and quantities in opposing directions. I don't know if that answers your question.
So we have 3 minutes left. There is another question by Chang Ma. If it is brief, we can do it. So Francisco, can you open the microphone for him? Thank you.
Okay,
Hi. Yes, hi guys. So a very interesting paper. One quick question is that I understand these two hypotheses will generate increased correlation between the food and the oil. But I was wondering, what causes the latest trend, which is the correlation has been going down?
The same as those for the correlation going up, but in the other direction, right? So if the relative importance of common drivers versus idiosyncratic market supply price shifters, if these common drivers become relatively less important, again, near the very end of our sample, then you would see the unconditional correlation drop again. Same for the spillovers. If the spillovers are there, increasing the unconditional correlation, but then the spillovers disappear, then the conditional correlation will drop again as well. I think that answers your question, unless you were interested or really asking for the reason why biofuels, why the biofuel transmission channel matches the time variation that we observe. I don't know if that was your question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can use the increase and the decline, the correlation to isolate whether it's biofuel story or the information story. So
from the timing pattern of the spillovers, we can for sure not allocate these spillovers to either a biofuel story or the financial friction story. It is just by looking at these additional results of the non-oil, non-food commodity prices and the business condition index and composite leading indicators, by looking at those extra results, we can say that there is something else going on beside biofuels. So biofuels may be part of the transmission from oil to food prices, but these additional results show that something else is going on, and this something else matches really, really nicely with what you would expect given in this model of Zocking and Xiong of the informational friction story. And so in the updated version of the paper, you will see that we can relate this to the size of the spillover to financialization and uncertainty and macro uncertainty.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Francisco, for the discussion. We will have now a 10 minutes break, and we will come back with the next presentation.